Hi,
Hi, Adir. How are you?
good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Beseda.
Okay. I just making you a co-host.
Great.
So now I think you can for sure mute and
Yeah,
unmute.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Here we are. So I will stop now. Okay.
Okay. I'm
Perfect.
so happy that we got so many more people since yesterday.
That's great. I know Suzanne sent something out to a list.
Yeah.
You know Suzanne?
And Rolia as well, I think.
Do you know Suzanne?
Suzanne Schechter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know her through the NIF?
I actually met her through Encounter.
Ah, cool.
Yeah.
How was Encounter?
It had a huge impact because most American Jews, even well-informed progressive American Jews, have no idea what it's like on the other side, as it were, what it's like in Palestine. No idea. Have no idea what the impact of occupation is. And just the fact that they provide that exposure is really valuable. I think, whatever, I have my critiques about how they could put that to work better, but the principle of mere exposure, רק החשיפה הזאת, ממש משמעותית.
כן, כן, נכון.
ממש משמעותית.
Yeah, I hear a lot of good things.
עצום. You hear what?
I hear a lot of good things about, and I think it's important, it's important to make the dialogue more honest.
It's hard. Oh, it is hard. There is no sugarcoating. It is really hard, and traumatic for people. Hi, Roy.
Shalom.
Shalom, shalom. היי.
דוד, מה שלומך אביר?
בסדר, מה שלומך?
בסדר. מה שלומך דוד?
הכל בסדר, תודה.
אתה בבית או ב...
אני בבית.
יופי.
אני בבית. זה הכסיתה שלי.
הכסיתה, איפה?
הכסיתה. בחצר. יש לנו בנפרד. יש לנו בית יפהפה, אבל גם כסיתה שאנחנו בנינו, זה חדר העבודה שלי, וזה גם חדר שינה לאורחים.
יפה, מאוד.
מאוד נחמד.
כל הספרים שלך.
כן.
יופי.
עכשיו הבת האמצעית שלי נמצאת כאן, אז היא בדרך כלל יושנת כאן.
איפה טלי?
טלי בברוקלין.
בברוקלין. גם מאיה בברוקלין.
אנחנו נוהגים.
כן,
איך אתם?
בסדר, אנחנו...
מחזיקים מעמד?
מה?
מחזיקים מעמד?
מחזיקים מעמד בבית כל הזמן. קשה מאוד. אני כמעט לא יוצא.
רק אתמול אמרתי לעצמי, אני פשוט... בדרך כלל אני יוצא 3-4 פעמים ביום, אני הולך לטייל, אבל במרחק של כמה קילומטרים. אתמול בלילה אמרתי, אני קצת יוצא מדעתי. די כבר.
כן.
קצת לנשום, לברוח.
אבל אתה גר באיפה? בווסט...
רוברטסון.
פיקו רוברטסון.
זה מאוד יפה. אפשר לטייל, ואפשר לטייל בלי צפיפות.
כן.
אבל זה העולם שלי.
כן, בטח.
זה המיקרוקוסמוס שלי.
כן, בטח.
הנה חוסיין. Hi, Hussein.
Hi, Hussein.
Hello.
How are you, man?
Fine.
It's quite a background you got.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you some alternatives if you like.
How about the Cedars of Lebanon? Go back to your
I
root.
don't have that.
It doesn't matter to me.
We can do the Wraith here. How's the Wraith? Better?
Bring the Arab Gulf states back.
Oh.
Well, it's appropriate for the theme, it seems to me, but I haven't figured out, by the way, now we're getting somewhere. I haven't figured out how to do the backdrops. How do you do it?
Choose, okay, so you can go to preferences or right next to stop video in the lower left. You see the lower left there?
Yeah.
So there's a little arrow pointing upward next to stop video.
Yeah, choose virtual background.
Click on it and then choose virtual, and then you can import whatever image you want. Yeah. And it's okay. I also could do, if you all prefer.
This is fine.
Well, I could do none.
As I'm doing, yeah.
All right, I'll go with none then.
Well, do whatever you want. I mean,
this is nice.
The none?
The books there, yeah.
Okay.
The none, no. You have a lot of wonderful books there. What are you talking about?
I have some books.
What are those books to your left? It looks like a series. One of the green.
Oh, that's
red.
That's Hergé. It's the feuilleton intégral of Hergé. So beginning, and I don't have the very earliest. I'm not so interested in it. But.
So let's talk for a couple of
I've got
minutes
the
about
Catalogue raisonné of Warhol 1 and 2 there. That's kind of pricey.
Okay, Rolly, yeah.
Yeah, you wanted to say something, Rolly?
No, I want to say that I will, first of all, thank you both of you for agreeing to do this. It's great.
Sure.
We had planned to do it, you know, live, but everything else is on Zoom. So this is on Zoom, and I'm grateful that we were able to do it. I just will say a few opening words and set the stage, and then Abir will introduce both of you, and then you'll take it from there.
Okay, that sounds great.
You know, for an hour, and I mean, like an hour and 10 minutes. We don't have to go all the way to 3:30. If you want.
You know, I'm at your disposal. Honestly, I'm totally at your disposal vis-a-vis time. I'm free until 4:30. So.
I think an hour 15 minutes will be a good time.
Yeah, because people can't sit for that long, I think.
Yeah. Well.
And so we'll start with Rolly. I'll introduce you, then you do your thing, and then we'll open it for questions. Yeah.
And we will try and restrict ourselves. It will be a challenge, but we're going to really try to restrict ourselves to 40 or 45 minutes, and then open up for a half an hour or so.
Yeah, we'll do our best.
And now
we have about 70 people, no, who registered.
Yes, something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
How active are things, Rolly, online, Zoom? That's a short.
Yeah, good. Everything. We're doing everything on Zoom. Services on Zoom twice a day.
Do you have a morning minion?
We have a daily minion.
You have a daily minion on Zoom?
Yeah, morning and evening.
Morning and even.
And a lot of people join. We have
Great.
60, 70 people.
Really?
Yeah. So, households. Some of them have 2 people. So we have 75, 80 people each time.
So I go to a morning minion, and a good day is 25, which is impressive. I actually like it.
Yeah, it's really good. It gives a structure to the day. People really connecting. Yeah, everything was transformed into Zoom, including.
Yeah, this is my 5th hour. I'm entering my 5th and a half hour now.
Yeah, in the Zoom, huh?
Yeah, and I'll be on Zoom until 10 tonight, I think.
Wow.
Till 10?
Yeah.
Really?
I might get to eat around 3:30.
What do you got?
Just a whole bunch of meetings and events. I just did a briefing for House and Senate staffers, and after this, I got 2 more long meetings.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, I have days with 5 or 6 hours, but not 10, including teaching, which is a really, that's the most challenging experience because you have absolutely no idea how you're playing. I mean, that whole magic of the interpersonal dynamic, has evaporated.
Right.
And you just have no idea. You have absolutely no idea.
So also I thought that because I see like more people are admitting, so because we have so many people, I don't think I will allow them to like unmute themselves.
Yeah.
Don't allow them to unmute themselves.
At least for the beginning, and we'll do the questions we'll tell them to write to me.
Yeah.
I'll just
write to you. not chat to everybody.
That's how I did it. I've been moderating things with, 300, 250, viewers, and I have them chat to me the questions or email or tweet, and then I have some people who are sending me the emails and the tweets, and then I sort of synthesize them and ask the guests.
Yeah, I even maybe let them ask the question, but I want to see who they are. And then it's just, I think it would be nicer if they will ask the question, then I will ask their question. It will be a little bit
that's
more
fine.
interactive,
Yeah.
but for sure they will be unmuted in the beginning.
We got raided last week.
Oh,
Did you?
2 weeks ago, yeah, in the middle of prayer. We got invaded by a group of mostly teenagers saying racial slurs and fuck you and putting nude pictures, and it was difficult to control them because they were moving around.
Yeah. My wife got Zoom bombed while teaching her undergraduate class. And you just wonder, who's doing this? I mean, who?
These were teenagers. I mean,
thousands of people are doing it.
Both teenagers.
It was not organized white supremacists. It was like some.
It was not.
No, it was some group of teens who.
That sounds more likely.
Okay, it's 1:30. I'm starting letting people in, just for you to know. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Thank you for joining us. We'll start in a few minutes. We just let more people in because I know more people signed up, so we'll wait. I know you are muted. It's intentional. We just, I'll explain in a few minutes. Hello for the people to just joined us. We'll begin in a few minutes. I guess we will wait 2 more minutes and then we'll start, just to be conscious of everybody's time. Nice to see so many familiar faces. Hi. Okay, I think we will start. Rabbi Rolly Matalon, do you want to say a few words in the beginning?
Yes, I want to welcome everyone. It's great that we are able to be together this way. I see there are people here from different parts of the country who are connected to BJ in some way. I see my friend Rabbi Dario Fegin from Seattle. I see Karen Adler in Miami. So it's great that we can be together. I just want to give a brief introduction. In the late 80s, we had one of the most transformative classes at BJ, and it was taught by two Palestinian scholars and two Israeli Jewish scholars. And it was a course that took 2 semesters and examined in parallel Palestinian nationalism and Jewish nationalism, Zionism, and the creation of Israel and all its implications. And it was over 20 weeks, and it was, as I said, in parallel, and it was an incredible experience for those of us who attended this. And I realized that after that, it was almost impossible to have something like this, because the reaction against having dual narratives presentations was so harsh and so vicious that then we went back to what's more prevalent, or almost the only thing that exists, which is a narrative on one side or the other that seeks to obliterate or supersede the other side. And so I am really, really grateful to Professor David Meyers, who made an opening on, we were together on the encounter, one of the encounter groups last year in February, and I see that Yona Shimtov is here, who directs this incredible institution encounter. And David there made a presentation and opened the possibility for us to have this presentation today, which we were going to have in person at BJ, but this is almost better because we can have people from all over. And he told me that he had done this with his colleague, Professor Hussein Ibish, and so I jumped on the opportunity, and generously both of them agreed to be with us and present this sort of dual narrative, this presentation, which is a dual narrative thing. And that's the only way, I think, that there can be coexistence, is for both narratives to be allowed to exist side by side and to be in dialogue and to be and to examine together each other and to be in conversation. And so that's what we're here for today. So without further ado, and thanking everybody for joining us, and thanking Hussein and David, I turn to Abir, who is our Director of Israel Engagement at BJ, and Israel Shaliach, to introduce the presenters.
Thank you, Rolly. Okay, so just a few words before I begin. First of all, we're going about the structure. We're going to hear our wonderful speakers. I'm going to present them in a second. Right after that, we're going to have some time for Q&A, quick Q&A. And I know that you're all muted. It's intentional. It's just we understanding that with so many participants, it's hard. And, you know, also for security reasons, it's hard to, if the participants are not muted. But in the end, while we get to the question part, I will unmute you. We'll do it in order. So you can notice that you can write in the chat below, you can write messages to me. So while the presentation is going on, if you have any question coming to your mind, just write it down. And in the end, I'll present the questions as much as we can to the speakers. So let's begin. We have two wonderful speakers speaking and dealing with such an important topic. And I think this topic is getting more and more attention. And I'm so happy about it. And I'm so happy that we can be a part of that. Let's begin. Dr. Hussein Ibish is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, and a weekly columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and The National. He previously served as a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, executive of the Foundation of Arab American Leadership, and communication director for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. He has a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Marist. Professor David Meyers is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Professor of Jewish History at UCLA, where he serves as the director of the UCLA Laskin Center of History and Policy. He's the author or editor of 15 books in the field of Jewish history. Meyers also serves as president of the New Israel Fund. Thank you so much for being with us, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to my dear friend Hussein Ibish for agreeing to do this. I'll say a little bit more about our partnership, but I do want to begin by extending my thanks to the BJ community, to Rabbi Roli, my dear friend, to Abir, my new friend, to Suzanne Schechter, who had a major hand in cooking this idea up. We were supposed to be with you physically on, I think it was April 19th, Sunday, April 19th. We're a few days off, and I'm, as a medieval poet said, located Besof Ma'arav at the end of the west, looking eastward toward one of my most blessed spiritual homes, New York City. It's the best we can do under the circumstances, and it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. I want to just say a word about what Hussein and I have been doing for the last several years. I was asked to teach a class, actually by the New Israel Fund in Los Angeles on the history of Zionism. And as I began to think about it, I realized that it really didn't make sense for an adequate understanding of the situation today to teach the history of Zionism in isolation. And I made then and there a kind of resolution to myself that never again would I teach the history of Zionism in isolation from the history of Palestinian nationalism. That in order to understand the evolution of Zionism, one really had to place it in context and connection with Palestinian nationalism. And I invited to co-teach that class Dr. Hussein Ibish 7 years ago, I think. And it was a kind of magical chemistry between us. Not that either of us is particularly magical, but the chemistry between us was. And we just understood the need to entwine the story of one and the story of the other. And we also made the decision then and there that we would do it, this same kind of work together, wherever we were asked to do it. We would avail ourselves of the opportunity because so often when teaching the history of the conflict, one narrative is told to the exclusion of the other and leads to a fundamentally one-dimensional account. And we thought we have a new way of approaching this, not that we invented the dual narrative approach, but we had the initiative, the energy, and decided, wherever invited we would come. And really what lies at the core of the approach is the belief that exposure to the story of the other is an essential humanizing act. And indeed the essential humanizing act toward any meaningful notion of resolution or justice. And so we've been doing this for a long time, and we're thrilled to be doing it with you, although it will be in somewhat altered form. What we had planned to do was to offer a dual narrative approach to really get at the lived experience of Jews and Arabs through the prism of three pivotal moments in the history of the conflict: 1917, 1947, 1948, and 1967. So 1917, the conflict that culminated in the creation of Israel and the Palestinian displacement, 1948, and 1967. this format and the urgency of the day have altered our plan, and we're going to begin with the present, take a quick descent into the past through 4 temporal markers, 4 pivotal moments in time, and then talk about the future. So we're really trying to cover all of those time dimensions in a relatively short period of time, and we will try, as we always try to do, but usually fail, to be brief, bouncing back and forth as is our way. So I'm going to now put up a PowerPoint presentation, share my screen, and we will begin our journey together by inquiring into the question, where are we today? So this is the news as of several hours ago. As most of you know, on the Israeli side, an agreement has been reached between the Likud and blue-white parties, Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, to create a government that will rest on the principle of a rotation in the position of prime minister. The first 18 months to be served by Netanyahu, the next 18 months to be served by Benny Gantz as prime minister, with the other as alternate prime minister. It was also decided the first 6 months of the tenure of this government would be an emergency government dealing with the public health crisis at hand. There would be a division in the government equally in terms of the number of ministers, which I should add is a very high number of ministers and will create substantial new budgetary burdens for the state of Israel to create these new ministries and offices accompanying them. Perhaps of greatest significance in terms of the long-term impact of this coalition government for the future is clause 29 of the agreement, which allows for a decision to be made either by the government, which is to say by the cabinet, or by the Knesset, if it doesn't pass the cabinet, to annex territory based on seemingly the approval of the United States as of July 1st, 2020. So for many of us concerned about the future of the region, this is a hugely significant clause, and one that raises the question of what Mr. Gantz was hoping to get out of this arrangement. It's interesting to note that a substantial majority of the Israeli public, according to recent polls, supports the coalition agreement, this New Deal, based on a sense of just pure fatigue at the stalemate and the dysfunction that is obtained for some 17 months and 3 elections. The alternative to a failure here was a 4th election, which would have taken place in August, which many Israelis regarded as just unbearable, embarrassing, and a huge waste of public resources. And so this provisional, very quickly constituted survey suggests that a majority of Israelis support the coalition agreement, including some 57% of the voters of the blue-white party. For many who didn't, many who fall into the 38%, the coalition agreement represents a huge mystery as to why Benny Gantz, who seemed to have an alternative path to Balfour Street to the prime minister's position, chose to go in this direction, rather than what admittedly would be a very strange coalition that includes right-wingers like Avigdor Lieberman on one hand and the Joint Arab List on the other hand. There were intimations that he might go in that direction, but ultimately didn't, went in this direction, where there will be a larger majority in the Knesset, but deep strains in his own ideological positions. In fact, his party has fractured at the news of this coalition agreement, with 2 of the major figures, Moshe Ya'alon and Yair Lapid, saying, we're going to leave the blue-white party and go to the opposition. Based on, in the first instance, the principle that the party ran on the platform that it would not serve with Netanyahu, a prime minister under indictment, who is trampling, so they said, a number of fundamental democratic principles. So what we're going to do is not just dwell in the present, but take a look back at how we got to where we are through 3 or 4 key moments in the past. But before we begin that return to the past, I want to hand things over to Hussein to introduce himself and say a brief word about how things look on the Palestinian side.
Well, thanks very much for joining us today, and it's a great honor to speak to you. Look, I think we are in what to a lot of Palestinians, at least in given the narrative of history that is almost universally embraced with different variations among Palestinians, find themselves feeling again that their future, the future of their society, of what they consider their country and of their nation, as it were, or their collective future is being decided by other people without much input, if any, from them, and without them being able to do much about it. Now that you could, I mean, and from in the Palestinian narrative, this is more than 100 years old as an experience that keeps getting played out, beginning with the first Zionist Congress in Bal, and then kind of discussions between the Zionist movement and the Ottoman government, and then bringing in Western powers, and so on. And the idea of the United States and Israel setting up a committee, a mapping committee, to determine what parts of the occupied West Bank Israel can keep with no Palestinian role whatsoever in that conversation is a very familiar one. Feels much like the lead up to the Balfour Declaration, much like the Mandate, much like the Partition Resolution, much like the years when the whole thing was contested between the Arab states and Israel. It's very familiar. It would be entirely possible to question that narrative and ask where Palestinian agency begins and ends, and to start to interrogate the idea that they haven't played a role in their fate, because I think everyone does. On the other hand, this is a pretty remarkable sort of pattern over a very long period of time. The bottom line is, though, that the Palestinian public falls into 3 or 4 camps, none of which has an answer to how to deal with this reality where if the Israeli government gets the green light to go ahead from the Trump administration, from the United States, to go ahead with large-scale annexations and take all or most of the settlement blocks and the Jordan Valley, that will put paid to anything any Palestinian whatsoever would recognize as a Palestinian state. Take the 2-state solution utterly off the table, mean that not only 1948, but 1967 is irreversible, and force Palestinians again, for the 4th time in their modern history, to try to reimagine what their national project's goal should be. And that's always a very, very painful, wrenching, divisive thing to do. And that there's just not much they can do about it. The first camp is the largest one, dominated by the PLO and the PA, and it is committed to securing a negotiated 2-state agreement with Israel, preferably through direct negotiations mediated by Washington, the Oslo process. That has proven wholly ineffective. And even the PLO doesn't really believe in it anymore under the current circumstances, though they hold out hopes that it could be revived. They're not confident about that. Or their plan B is internationalization, going to the UN, et cetera. And I think even they must know that that's a complete dead end as well. So they have this vision that's in tune with international law and normalcy and UN Security Council resolutions and the Oslo agreements, including the 1993 Declaration of Principles and other things, but it's just not effective. And their plan B is also not effective. The second camp is that of the Islamists, Hamas being the largest group among them, but there are other Islamists, obviously, Islamic Jihad and whatnot, who have this rhetoric about armed struggle until victory, maybe with a long-term truce, a hudna with Israel, etc. And it's totally obvious to everybody, including Hamas, that armed struggle is disastrous for Palestinians. The Second Intifada was a complete catastrophe from which Palestinian society has yet to recover. And every single time there is a prolonged exchange of violence between Israelis, or even before them, the Jewish settlers in Palestine, the Jewish community in pre-Israel Palestine, and the Palestinians. Palestinians have always had the worst of it, both in terms of the outcome and in terms of lives lost. There has never been a situation in which Palestinians were not the big losers on both counts whatsoever. So armed struggle just doesn't work. It is the only way, apparently, to get Israelis to pay attention to the Palestinian issue, to remember that there's an occupation and put it not as an afterthought, but a forethought. But the price is very high. So that doesn't work either. And Hamas has no idea what to do. So both of these groups ruling in their respective areas, the West Bank and Gaza, respectively, are all they can do is hold on to their power. Really nothing more than that. The third group are the sort of local community leaders on the ground in the West Bank who practice what's called sumud, steadfastness. They do a lot of the local protests. They do a lot of the kind of on the ground stuff, and it keeps the ball in the air. It keeps gives people a sense of agency, but it doesn't achieve much, if any. It really doesn't achieve anything in terms of the national interest. It just keeps a sense of solidarity and agency going. And the fourth group are the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Arab Israelis, who voted in the last election, the third of the three elections in the past year, quite, substantially, and ended up with a bloc with the third largest group in the Knesset. But between their own reluctance to engage with Jewish Israeli parties they consider Zionist and vice versa, they ended up being frozen out anyway and having very little impact on Gantz's deal with Netanyahu. And so one wonders if they will, there's every danger that they will regard the outcome here as vindicating those who said there's no point whatsoever, there's no real space for us in the politics of Israel, because it is a Jewish discourse in which we cannot enter, whether we like it or not. Whether we want to or not, we kind of don't. But even if we did, there's no space for us, and it just won't work. That's been a siren song. It would be a tragedy if that were the lesson that were falsely learned, but I think it may well be. We'll see. But my point is, none of these approaches offers anything much in terms of dealing with the situation the Palestinians find themselves in. So you've got utter stasis, and it's sort of instantiated in the fact that Abbas has been in power since 2005, and the Hamas government in Gaza is since 2006, and nothing's moving. In other words, since the death of Arafat. I'm sorry, I think I exaggerated by a few years, but that is in fact the trajectory. It's decades since there's been any change, and nobody wants an election because everyone thinks they might lose. So there you go.
Okay, thank you, Hussein. Now we're going to begin to make our way back to the past, and we'll very briefly refer to a number of key moments. And our discussion is meant to be really suggestive. We don't have time to go into depth. This is what we had hoped to do in person, and we look forward to doing that on another occasion. But I want to go back first to 1967. In terms of understanding how we got where we are, how did we get to a point where it seems almost as a foregone conclusion that there will be annexation, that the momentum of history has been moving in that direction such that it is almost inescapable, or so it seems. And
I think your sound is cutting out.
done.
David, I don't think we
Yeah, your sound is cutting
hear
out.
you really well.
He's having Wi-Fi issues.
All right. David, are you with us? Yeah, he's sort of frozen here. Maybe he'll have to log
He's
back.
gonna come back. Yeah, he's gonna come
All
back.
right.
Watch for him, Abir.
Yeah.
Let him in.
Okay.
Hi. Yes, I'm sorry.
There you go.
I'm back. This is the vagary of Zoom. I've been cutting out. Let's see if we're having bandwidth problems. Yes, I'm going to switch off my camera. That's a good idea.
Okay.
So I'm sorry that I had to do that, but I've been cutting out. And I'm going to hold off
Oh dear.
for now and just mention the first of our moments, 1967, which unleashed, in addition to the territorial conquest and the sense of exhilaration that attended Israel's stunning military victory on the Jewish-Israeli side, it also, I think, unleashed a new form of messianically informed religious Zionism that has been extraordinarily powerful in subsequent Israeli political culture, which has exerted an extremely important role in really pushing forward the project of settling the newly conquered territories as part of a grand divine vision of Israel settling and reclaiming the greater land of Israel. This is not a mere theological abstraction because religious Zionism has become an extremely powerful and skilled political player in the Israeli political system. And the first moment of significance in sort of charting how we got to where we are, how we have reached this point where we have what seems to be an enshrined right-wing government in power with a set of ethno-nationalist policies, I think begins in 1967 in the emergence of this new form of religious Zionism.
Yeah, for the Palestinians, I think the main significance of 67 is that it consolidated the growing realization that 1948 was not reversible, that the loss of their society, the loss of most, if not all of their country was not reversible, and that they had to shift. It took about 12 years to really consolidate this view, maybe more among Palestinians, that the struggle needed to shift from trying to eliminate the Israeli state and restore the status quo ante before 1948, restore Palestinians to their property and homes and whatnot lost in 1947-48, to creating a Palestinian state alongside Israel in the occupied territories. In other words, starting to build on the logic of UN Security Council resolutions 242 and then subsequently 338. And eventually Palestinians got there. And so that really set up the expectation that now is being dashed. I'll leave it at that.
So we're going to move quickly because we want to leave as much time for questions as possible, as well as a discussion of the future, to the second major moment of significance that begins in 1977. So if 67 unleashed on the Jewish-Israeli side, this new potent form of religious Zionism, 1977 represented in Israeli political history what is known as Hamapach, the overturning of 30 years of Labor Party rule, and the beginning of a new era in Israeli political history, marked by the ascent of the longtime opposition party Likud and its longtime opposition leader, Menachem Begin, to power. Begin came with a decidedly right-wing nationalist agenda, a commitment to a capitalist privatization oriented economic policy, a real dedication and outreach to those who dwell in what is known as the periphery, that is to say the socioeconomic, those who represent the socioeconomic disadvantaged in Israel, particularly Jews of Mizrahi origin, who regarded Menachem Begin really as one of their own. And these various elements of Likud's ideology and strategy came together And following the fatigue of 30 years of Labour Party rule, we have the emergence of a new potent political force in Israeli Israeli life. What I think is especially important to note is that 1977 really inaugurates a new arc in Israeli political history. For all intents and purposes, Israel has been under the reign of that arc since 1977, with 8 or so years as an outlier, as an exception. So when we think of the entire history of the state of Israel, you can divide it, at least in terms of its political history, in a period from 1948 to 1977, and from 1977 to the current moment. This important arc begins in 1977. It joins the strand or stream that emerged in 1967. So you have an intermingling between this new potent form of religious Zionism and the new, how should we call it, ethnocentric nationalism of Likud, forming this very important new force in Israeli life. Hussein.
No, go right ahead. Just carry on.
Do you want to say a word about the effects of 78, 79?
No, I think we should move. I think we should just move straight along. Let's just go on.
So the next moment, the third moment of significance, the third moment of significance that we want to talk about is the Oslo period, which is in some way the outlier in that large block of time dominated by Likud. A period from 1993 to 2001. We don't have a lot of time to go through it, but what is significant is that it marks, at least in the Israeli worldview, the emergence of what seemed to be unimaginable prior to that point, the prospect of peace between two long-standing rivals and enemies, the Israelis and Palestinians. We also know that the negotiations themselves, I was going to bring you the incredible picture of President Bill Clinton sort of physically bringing together Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin on the lawn of the White House in September 1993. What emerged from that was this enticing prospect of reconciliation between rivals of a century. It also unleashed violent opposition in both the Israeli and Palestinian publics. And what emerges at the end of that process, and particularly in the difficult years following the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin on November 4th, 1995, and then the ascent to the prime minister's seat of Bibi Netanyahu in shocking fashion in 1996, a total surprise in the wake of the Rabin assassination, was a sense of growing difficulty and then impossibility of actually arriving at an agreement, notwithstanding the sincerest efforts of a small cadre of Israeli, Palestinian, and American negotiators. This vision, which seemed so promising on the White House lawn in 1993, came to a crashing halt with the outbreak of the Second Intifada. One of the images I was going to show you was of Minister without portfolio, then Ariel Sharon, making his way to a visit on the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, which was certainly a precipitant, a catalyst in inducing anger in the Palestinian sector, and really represented, in a certain sense, a different discursive thread. If Oslo promised the idea of comedy and harmony and coexistence, that action and actions on the Palestinian side in 2000 really suggested that that the ideal of reaching a grand reconciliation was not really possible. So we see the arc of this 8-year period from 1993 to 2001 moving from great hope to despair and desperation.
All right, I want to talk about both in the same breath, because I think 79 and 1979, with the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, was that the conflict shifted away from the Arab-Israeli confrontation between Israel and the Arab states, back to one between Israel and the Palestinian people, or between Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs, wherever they are, over control over that territory between the river and the sea. With the Egyptian withdrawal from the potential armed conflict, any war between Israel and it was basically off the table. So it became, again, a matter of Israelis and Palestinians. Based on that peace treaty, the Arabs, including Jordan, Syria, and the Palestinians, concluded that the basic deal that was available with the Israelis was, you recognize Israel and have full diplomatic and trade relations, even if it's, you know, a cold peace or whatever, and you get back the territory conquered in 1967. And the land for peace that's built into 242 and the 1973 version of 242, which is 338, the UN Security Council resolutions, right? That's what Palestinians thought they were entering into in 1993. That's the framework through which they viewed the Declaration of Principles and all the Oslo agreements. They thought that in the end of this process, by say, 2003 or something like that at the latest, they would start to see the formation of a Palestinian state in not all of the occupied Palestinian territories, but almost all, that there would be some accommodation for settlements, some kind of special arrangement on Jerusalem, but that basically you would see some kind of a replication of that. And indeed, the Jordanians got the same deal from the Israelis, and the Syrians were going to get something very close to that, with an exception of a little strip of land around Lake Tiberias to keep the Syrians away from the water of what the Israelis call the Kinneret. What turns out is that the Israelis never shared this understanding, is that in fact that deal was not available. And what we saw at Camp David was a meeting between Barak, Arafat, and Clinton, in which the Palestinians were confronted with the reality that when they said Palestinian state and Israel said Palestinian state, they were referring to two completely different things. And I think what 2000 and the failure of Camp David set in motion was a situation where the Israelis ultimately, and I predicted this at the time privately to everyone I knew, would ultimately have little alternative but to try to impose by force, because they could, what they really wanted and what the Palestinians turned down at the Camp David negotiations, which was a peace treaty involving limited statehood in a bifurcated area of Palestinian autonomy, super autonomy or limited autonomy, whatever kind of autonomy, within a de facto greater Israel. And I think that finally is on the table with the Trump proposal, and that is where we are today. So that is, I'm sorry, a long answer, but it covers a lot of territory.
Right, and I think that sensibility, that insight really draws from the strands that we've identified from 1967 to 1977 with the Oslo years as a seeming outlier, but yet fitting into the larger puzzle. I want to move to the fourth and final point before we talk very briefly about the future, which is what I think of as the Netanyahu decade, beginning with Netanyahu's return to the office of the prime minister in 2009. He had served, as I mentioned, in the wake of Rabin's assassination for the first time from 1996 to 1999, then was defeated by Ehud Barak. Returned to the prime minister's office in 2009. And I think it's really important to note that this election coincides with the election of someone who has become a close friend and ally of his, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who also had served a previous tour of duty as prime minister and also was returned to power in 2010, and returned to power with a new commitment to really alter the rules of democratic theory as he understood it. I mean, he really gave explicit voice to this in a series of speeches in which he called for a new guiding set of principles, which he called illiberal democracy. And I think Netanyahu has embraced many of the principles of Orban's illiberal democracy in this last decade, as we've seen just a huge reaction against the forces of globalization and the return of a kind of ethnocentric nationalism. Orban is the grand theoretician of that movement, and its precepts are simple. Majoritarianism, which is to say the rule of the majority, as against the aspirations or rights of either individuals or groups, minority groups within. Xenophobia, a fear of outsiders, isolationism, and a sense that given that majoritarian sensibility, that allows someone who has 50+1% to really alter the rules of the democratic game. And I think we have seen that surely, sorry?
No, go ahead.
I think we have seen that in spades in Hungary up to the last few days. And we have seen it, unfortunately, in Israel as well. And again, I think it's not at all coincidental that Netanyahu and Orban are friends and allies. In the Israeli case, it's important to note just one political factor, which is the near total disappearance of any self-identified left, a victim in many ways of the collapse of the Oslo dream, amplified by the fortification of those ethno-nationalist currents that begin in 67 and 77, and then orchestrated quite masterfully by Bibi Netanyahu. Some of the features of illiberal democracy are, in the Israeli version, are assaults on the usual elites, which we see, alas, in our own country, assaults on the judiciary, on the press, vilification of political opponents, threats to jail or imprison political opponents. These are all hallmarks political scientists say of, these are warning signs political scientists tell us of the decline of a democratic order. Right. There have also been legislative acts advanced by the government, which you see here, culminating in the July 2018 nation-state law, which really, I think, represents the enshrinement in almost constitutional form, in quasi-constitutional form, that is to say, in a basic law of the Knesset, of the ethnocentric principle, ordaining that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, making no reference to minorities, Arabs, or democracy for that purpose. And so we see this decade as really fortifying and crystallizing currents that began in 67 and 77 and really found their grand practitioner in Bibi Netanyahu. Hussein, I'm going to hand it over to you before we move ahead very briefly to the future, and then.
Yeah, I've already described the stagnation on the Palestinian side. So that task is done. And all I can say is that what's really important now is what happens in between now and November in terms of whether Trump is going to greenlight large annexations, stop all annexations, or give what I have a piece tomorrow in Bloomberg, for which I'm a weekly columnist, saying, that maybe in a way the most likely thing is a flashing yellow light, where he tells Netanyahu he can take a little bit, maybe like Ma'ale Adumim or a couple of settlements that most Palestinians have assumed would end up as part of Israel anyway, and just establish the precedent. I've always suspected that for Trump, these annexations are a second-term project, and the first term was designed to destroy the two-state solution and replace the U.S. bipartisan consensus for a two-state solution with a much more heterogeneous conversation that includes a big space for greater Israel annexationism. And I think he's been very successful in that regard. I'm not sure he wants another headache at the moment, which I think a big annexation would give him. And so he may not go along with this. And then the question would be what happens in November. I think Palestinians, as I said before, are again feeling very much like bystanders in their own drama. And it's a very difficult thing for them to do, but none of the existing strategies have proven effective.
Right, so just to offer maybe a final word before we open up. One of the most important potential consequences of the new coalition government is this commitment to move forward with a discussion and decision on annexation. As you can see in this slide here, the Netanyahu plan is to annex much of the Jordan Valley region, which is a substantial portion of what would become a Palestinian state. the Trump plan is it calls for Israeli sovereignty over any area with substantial Jewish settlement, which is a somewhat different proposition. Hence the map commission that that Hussein mentioned. What is really the important long-term question is the sequence. Just briefly, Netanyahu has a number of major legal hurdles to contend with, including his trial for corruption, for bribery and fraud, which is scheduled for May 24th. There are all sorts of questions posed about whether he should be serving as an indicted prime minister and what happens if and when he is convicted, what will be. So these hover over, over his head. But in terms of Israel-Palestine, what really can be a game changer is the movement towards annexation, which seems not unlikely and which really opens up the prospect of a world beyond the long-regnant two-state model that began, as Hussein mentioned, with United Nations resolutions in 1967. What will be, if not that solution? Are we headed toward an inevitable one-state solution or one-state lack of solution, one-state reality, which takes many forms, some of which are idealized forms and some of which are just affirmations of the status quo? These are the great questions that lie ahead. And I would say they're accompanied by a whole set of other questions that Israel, Palestine, and the world faces, such as what is the fate of democracy? What is the fate of liberal democracy that places such a premium on the rights of individuals and, for that matter, minority groups afforded protections under democratic order? What will be the economic consequences of the public health disaster unfolding before us? How important will climate change be? And of course, demography, especially in Israel and in the region, is an extremely important factor.
Can I say something?
These are all really topics that we were going to talk about at greater length. Hussein will finish up and then we'll open up.
No, it's really interesting that both Israel, government of Israel, or at least Israeli authorities, health authorities and other authorities, and the PA have tried their best to cooperate on the coronavirus because it's in their interest not to have it spread in their own areas and between them and what have you. But the realities of the occupation have meant that despite that determination on both sides to cooperate, it's been very hard and it's been very, very limited. There's been a tremendous will to do it on both sides, but the reality is not one of cooperation. It's one of discipline and control and dysfunctionality on the Palestinian side. So,
Abir, we're going to open it up now. Much more to say, but I'm sure there are others with interesting things to say as well.
Please.
Okay, thank you so much for that. That was amazing. We do have some questions here. I think what we will try to do is to let people ask their own questions. Because there are not so many. So I'll just refer to a person and we'll see how it goes. So the first will be Alexander.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, really good.
Okay, thanks. So thanks for all the interesting materials and ideas put forward. I noticed, David, that you refer to your project as an essentially humanizing act. And I want to commend you on this, both of you and everyone who works with you on this. But obviously, from abroad, we can all be interested and discuss. But it's eventually the people on the ground there that will need to move towards a solution.
Right.
So how would you say, do you have any ideas about how to multiplicate this experience on the ground? And would you say that it's necessary to go through like official channels like education or state communication, both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side?
Yes. So, Abir, do you want me to answer directly or should we?
Sure.
Yes. Okay, so thank you, Alexander, and thank you for your recommendation that I turn off my video, which has prevented me from dropping off as I had a few times before. This too is an uphill battle. I've worked with someone whom Yona knows, Professor Sami Adwan from Bethlehem, who is one of the real innovators in dual or now multiple narrative curricula, a scholar of education and of curriculum development. I've worked with him, and he has worked closely with a number of Israeli partners to produce some really remarkable first and second generation materials that present dual and then soon enough multiple narrative voices. What has been the case is that both Palestinian and Israeli ministries of education have been singularly unreceptive. So the way that Sami and his partners in Israel, Ayal Naveh, and others have proceeded is by recruiting teachers to the task who insert some of the methodology and content of the dual narrative approach into their classroom. They are somewhat constrained by the dictates of their respective ministries, but they also have some measure of latitude. About 2 years ago, we had a conference at UCLA that discussed the dual narrative approach. We brought teachers from Palestine and Israel, as well as local teachers from the LA Unified School District, to talk about how we can continue to refine the actual materials and make inroads in the ways that I think change will come if and when change comes, which is to say, from the bottom up. I think we cannot expect the ministries of education in either realm to overnight decide to adopt this approach. As in so many things in life, much positive, constructive change comes from the bottom up, comes from the local, beginning school by school, community by community. And that is, I think, the theory of change that we need to think of in this kind of educational setting as well.
I would dissent a little bit from my friend David. I mean, I agree with everything he said. And if I didn't believe in this, I wouldn't be here. You know, obviously, I think it's very important. And I agree there's a big role for bottom-up stuff, that societies are made up of individuals who have their attitudes, and there's a lot to be done here. However, I would caution that that there is a very powerful structural aspect to the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, especially as between those who live under occupation and the Jewish Israelis who make up the bulk of the military. And in that sense, the relationship is one of discipline and control. And it's a relationship between citizens and non-citizens in what is a de facto single state and has been for many, many decades, I mean, over half a century. Under such circumstances, you can have all the understanding and goodwill and what have you that you like, but until you address the structural relationship where one side is enforcing control over the other, and effectively one part of the society is prisoners and the other side is guards, basically, in effect, it's going to be very hard to create narratives that move beyond that. In other words, you can create narratives that help you move beyond that, but they can't overcome that structural reality. That structural reality has to, at some point, change in order to facilitate additional transformation at the culture.
Of course, I can't disagree with that, my dear friend Hussein. Of course, that's absolutely right.
Right.
The question is, what can chisel away at the structure?
You're right.
And one thing I want to just point to is we may be experiencing a shift in the guiding discourse, at least amongst those who still harbor the hope of peaceful coexistence. And that is a shift. Let me just finish. That is a shift in discourse from the language of self-determination for two peoples to equality for all. And this is something I think is really important to pay attention to. We're hearing it in certainly Palestinian quarters. We're hearing it in some Israeli circles. And if this is the direction in which things continue to proceed, that is to say, toward an erasure of the green line, then one of the ways in which the structure of power is going to be challenged is by that discourse of equality. And we're beginning to hear that, and it's something we all need to pay attention to in the Jewish community in America.
The way the Israeli state has dealt with the status quo over the past few decades has been to treat the occupied, especially the West Bank, as if it were part of Israel, especially whenever a Jewish Israeli or any other Israeli sets foot in an area. That's the kind of virtual, mobile Israeli state, de facto Israeli state, and everywhere else is an indistinct, to be resolved occupation that is sort of amorphous. And you know, the annexations that are being contemplated, if they happen, erase that discourse. That discourse will no longer be a functional one. It's already sort of incoherent and bizarre. And you would get into the situation where Israelis and Palestinians would have to collectively define the nature of the new reality. And that answer that, well, here is the de facto Israel and here is the de facto not Israel, but it's not anything else either, won't work. So, yeah.
Back to you, Abir.
Thank you, Alexander. Let's hear from Noah Mintz.
So I actually, at my Jewish day school, took a course titled Dual Narratives, and I have to be blunt and admit, it really wasn't effective. And I think it's because you can throw a textbook called Dual Narratives, but it's really a matter of who's the teacher and who are the learners. So sitting with my peers and with one Jewish teacher and just giving this textbook didn't work. But yet, obviously, it's not possible for the two of you to go everywhere and have this conversation with different audiences. So now being in college and being seeing like that both perspectives can be in the room, how do you scale this kind of conversation, whether it's through a textbook or through trainings, or even like Fauda, for example? Do you think that embodies a dual narrative so that it can get out to broader audiences?
Yeah, thank you. Really, I share your caution about the experience, Noah, because if we look at the early generation dual narrative models, they're very wooden and rigid and don't allow for the kind of actual interaction and give and take that is so essential. I would say this, what has seemed to me to really work is first that principle of exposure. First, just hearing the narrative of the other and sitting in the room and hearing it presented by someone who comes not, from a position of great anger, not with the goal of persuading you of the political virtues of her or his position, but really just telling the historical narrative of this group of people as it understands it. And I think, one of the things we always begin by talking about is not only are there multiple narratives, but there are multiple truths in the conflict between Israeli Palestinians. There's a great deal of truth in the Zionist narrative of the move from exile to homeland. And there's a great deal of truth in the Palestinian narrative in the move from homeland to exile. And sometimes it's very difficult to reconcile them. Juxtaposing them and listening and being exposed, I would say, is the first and important step. The other thing that I think is just really important, if you can't bring in someone who in informed fashion can offer that kind of insight, is to really insist that, your professor of Jewish history, my colleague and friend, no doubt, when she teaches the history of Zionism and the history of Israel, incorporate within it, make not just as, an addition 1 week in the course, but really as a method, as a core epistemological proposition, use the lens of this dual narrative approach to read that history. I think we need to insist on that. And I think that's one way that we could advance the ball before I think we have, fully trained teams at scale to go around and do this work. I do know that it's very interesting. One interesting development in the blossoming field now of Israel studies, which has been an outgrowth of both Jewish and Middle Eastern studies, we're beginning to see the establishment of some programs devoted to Israel and Palestine studies, regarding the two as inextricable, and really seeing the need to study each in the context and relation to the other. And I think that's a really important and salutary development, and I hope it continues to expand and grow.
Yeah. Nothing to add.
Okay. Thank you, Noah. Let's hear from Judith and Mart.
Okay, so this is actually Martha. Judith is not here, but so This feels to me in some ways a funny question to ask as someone who spent her entire life in higher education. But, you know, I value tremendously what you're doing. I think making two narratives and two stories available to people is tremendously important. But it seems to me that what you have described, and it's not new to me from having read this material, what you have described are two possible narratives, but a political context that makes no space for them. Yeah. So, you know, there's a great way to talk about history, but I'm feeling, you know, as I have to say, as despairing, I guess, as I was before. I was hoping for somehow to end up not quite as despairing by the end of this that I was when I began. But do you see any place within the Israeli-Palestinian context that you have described for hope of some degree of autonomy or recognition for Palestinian identity politics? I mean, it's just, narratives are one thing, and you know, they're not unrelated to politics, but it's not all.
Let me give you a sense of where I see some hope, because I do. It's a sort of a, you know, a nihilistic vision in a way, but look, if these annexations go forward, all the existing Palestinian discourses will be in complete and total meltdown, and the strategies as well. And Palestinians will be forced for the third or fourth time in their modern history to go back to zero and try to figure out collectively what they can get out of the existing equation. You know, how they can advance their interests collectively, how they define them, and how they can get to where they need to go. I think they will have to reconcile themselves to the fact that, you know, an existence apart from Jewish Israelis is no longer possible. And then they will have to look at the narratives that have emerged in the one state constituency among Palestinians, and they will discover that it is a very aggressively nationalistic discourse that is, you know, entirely, that offers nothing to Jewish Israelis. It does not acknowledge their experiences, that does not offer them anything, that just simply seeks to impose a Palestinian perception on Jewish Israelis and demands that they accede to thus and such things because this version of history is to be insisted on. I think they're going to find, in other words, that if they want to pursue a different agenda, something to do with confederation with Israelis, with federalism, with trying to, you know, make lemonade out of lemons and get something decent out of this, they're going to have to come up with a narrative understanding that's much more attenuated and that gives space to Jewish Israelis and offers them something. And there, I think they're going to have to probably amend their rhetoric and rethink their way of looking at things, because if they stick with their narratives work for them, but their narratives are not going to work for Jewish Israelis. If they need to work with and live with Jewish Israelis because they cannot separate into two states and have the two narratives living side by side in two states, then they have to think through their narratives again, in my view.
But what about the Jewish Israelis?
So I'd say
that's up to them.
I'd say two quick things. One, we are in a very troubled and troubling time. The era of, to put it in the most benign terms, illiberal democracy. One thing that history teaches us is that the pendulum will swing. So I don't believe we are stuck in time and are unlikely to swing out of this era of hyper ethnocentric, xenophobic nationalism. We're in a bad way, and I believe there'll be another day. And friends of mine always say, but tomorrow could be worse than today. And I say, right, but there'll be a day after that. And we're building for the day after that. That's our job. So I'd say just a few things. One, I've called your attention to this emerging discourse of equality that has gained some traction, certainly on the Israeli left, but more importantly, for now in Palestine. And I think that's something that we have to pay attention to and observe and embrace in some sense. Because what's the alternative if we believe in principles of peace and justice and equality? So that's proposing theoretically and conceptually a way out of the trap that annexation seems to set, without necessarily determining ultimate political forms.
Right.
It's an important conceptual and theoretical underpinning to a potential alternative future. In more concrete terms, though, I would say that the performance of the Joint List is really, for me, a source of great encouragement. The Joint List, which is an unruly coalition of 4 discrete political parties ranging from the Islamists to sort of the hard nationalists, with one Jewish Arab party in between, has nonetheless the one Israeli political leader with a vision. His name is Ayman Odeh.
Yeah.
And he has actually an extraordinary and articulate vision.
Yeah,
it is the vision of Israel in the 21st century as dependent upon, as contingent upon a Jewish-Arab partnership.
Yeah.
Now, this may seem like a banal abstraction, but in his words, and in the emerging force that the Joint Arab List represents, and in its willingness to support Benny Gantz, it represents something quite more meaningful. And I think we may not agree with the politics of the Joint Arab List. We may not agree with all the politics of all of the parties in the Joint Arab List, but it is a new potent force. And unlike Hussein, I'm much more optimistic about its political future. I think that it has carved out a place for itself. The news of the coalition could be very discouraging, or there could be something very empowering to say that with increased voter turnout, this party, for something that replaces, can make a very serious difference. If it were, for example, to move from 15 to 20 seats, it would be a very significant force. It would be the opposition.
Yeah, it would.
I would get briefings on foreign and defense matters. So, look, the picture at present is not an excessively optimistic one. You're absolutely right about it. Are there currents that are circulating about upon which one can grasp, that offer glimmers of a better tomorrow? I think there are, and I would say the Joint Arab List and this idea of Jewish-Arab partnership, which has become a really significant political slogan of late, are 2 of them.
There's another one. The fact that there hasn't been another armed Palestinian uprising since the end of the Second Intifada is really important. It means that a whole generation and a half of Palestinians introjected the lesson that armed struggle is really counterproductive. And they have restrained kids who don't remember it. And they have really held back from that. And that is, really interesting and impressive to me. I don't know how long it lasts. It's being tested to its limits, but I think there's another basis for hope there, in the sense that the big majority of Palestinians, at least in the West Bank, are clearly committed to pursuing things politically and totally opposed to any kind of violence, including rioting or anything like that, let alone, arms.
Okay, I think we'll take one last question.
Oh, this guy here.
Just to be conscious of everybody's time. So let's hear from Sandra.
So to a certain extent, I think you've responded to the question that I will present, but having been born in 46, around the birthday of Israel, I never, for some reason, became a Zionist. I didn't understand it. And my question is, and to a certain extent, you've dealt with it, and Martha asked part of it, but what are the true political and structural impediments to a one-state solution from each side. It seems to me, I mean, as difficult as this country is, there is essentially a one-state solution. And it seems to me that, that's the only possible solution if we can get to it. And we is a joint we. That's why it's a joint discussion.
Okay, David, you want to go first?
You go ahead.
Okay, I'm happy to tell you on the Palestinian side, I think there are two problems. One is that there is this lingering sense of profound historical injustice that makes the demands of Palestinians in the context of a one-state solution dysfunctional. In other words, the Palestinians who embrace a one-state solution discourse say, okay, so we should have a one-state solution with a single vote for everybody in between the river and the sea. That already is very difficult for Jewish Israelis to hear, because it is basically not only post-Zionist. I mean, in my view, the Zionism, anti-Zionism argument is meaningless. It's anachronistic. You're talking about a state of Israel, and people who are born as Jewish Israelis, they're not Zionists. They're born in Israel. There's a big, this isn't some volitional affiliation there. That's who they are. But, and anti-Zionism seems pointless as well. So to me, it's about Israel and the way it relates to other peoples, and vice versa. So that essentially it looks to a future beyond the Israeli state, right, as it's currently constituted, a state dedicated to the Jews, either it's Jewish citizens or the Jews of the world, depending on how you want to look at it. That's already a big enough ask. But it goes beyond that. Then it talks about the right of return. So we got potentially hundreds of thousands, if not more, of Palestinians coming back. It has implicit in it the return of property, which would be most of the privately owned land that existed in what became the Israeli state in 1948. And a whole bunch of reversals in time, a whole bunch of reparations and recuperations of material possessions and land rights and things that is just not ultimately, I think, tenable. So that, in other words, it's one thing to say, like the ANC did in South Africa, all right, we're not going to do what we've been doing anymore, but we're not going to take your stuff away from you. We're not going to take your jobs away from you or anything like that. That was a deal that was possible because of the big disparity in populations, and it was a good deal for both sides. I don't see that deal here with the same kind of compelling logic as there was in South Africa. That's one thing. The second thing is that the Palestinians are still not in a place where they are willing to accept most Palestinians are still not in a place where they're willing to accept the Jewish Israeli narrative, a Jewish Israeli identity, as fully legitimate and fully, let's say, as absolutely authentic. There's still a desire to see it, not a desire, an impulse to see it as somehow faux, as jerry-rigged, as manufactured, as artificial, as imposed from the outside. And I think there was a time where you could have argued that to some extent, but right now you're talking about several generations of Jewish Israelis born into this. And as I said, the whole question of Zionism is irrelevant in that sense. You're talking about an organic identity that's not volitional. And that's got to change too. So to me, those are the two biggest problems. In other words, you need to have an agenda that's less kind of absurdly ambitious and unthinkable from a Jewish Israeli point of view in terms of its practical application, beyond just moving beyond the Jewish dominated Israeli state, but talking about undoing decades of acquisitive history and undoing decades of dispossession. I don't think that works. And then you need a different attitude towards Israeli identity and Israeli narratives. Yeah, but you may get there perforce because of annexations. Annexation may force Palestinians to embrace that in order precisely to box the Jewish Israeli population into accepting a situation of equality which they don't actually have to accept. In other words, the current status quo is something that Israel can enforce. There's nothing stopping it. And that's precisely why we've moved from offering this kind of arrangement at Camp David to enforcing this operation on the ground, potentially under Trump and Netanyahu. Because you can't, it's that whole thing. I did it because I can. I really want it, and I can do it. Therefore, I will do it.
Yeah, I'll say just a brief word, maybe by way of conclusion. Thank you for the question. What stands in the way of a one-state solution? So I just pick up on one thing that Hussein said, which is the unrealized ambition of self-determination for the Palestinians, given how at almost every significant turn in their history, that prospect was fleetingly offered and then retracted. And so there's a kind of unfulfilled sense of expectation. That's one. Number two is the overwhelming opposition of Israeli Jews to the idea of a single state in sort of probably the kind of sense that you had in mind, Sandra. And we'll talk about different visions in a second. But one thing that I have to mention as we think about alternatives to the status quo is that really one of the most powerful forces at work in the conflict is historical trauma. There is immense trauma playing a hugely significant role. And it's important to note this in the wake of yesterday, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. The Holocaust continues to exert an enormously powerful effect on Israeli Jews. Just as the Nakba, and the two are not at all equivalent in scale, it must be mentioned, but nonetheless, the Nakba too exerts an enormously powerful effect on Palestinians, essentially rendering the two communities eternal victims in their own self-rendering, and always, in a sense, needing to protect themselves lest the goal of extinction be realized. So I think it's really important to mention the impact of trauma in the conflict. That said, developments on the ground are moving towards the erasure of the Green Line and a one-state solution. Now, what does that mean? It can mean, first, the affirmation of the status quo with some variations, meaning there could be some official enshrinement of a distinction between citizens and subjects. That may be forced upon Israel to actually have to do to distinguish between who are citizens and who are subjects. Because otherwise, if everybody on the ground between the Jordan and the Mediterranean is a citizen, then Israel as a Jewish state would be voted out of existence tomorrow or in 5 years when there's a decisive Palestinian majority. So that's one vision of a one state, the affirmation of the status quo. A second is a Palestinian state that treats the Jewish minority within its midst as a hostile entity and remembers the historical trauma it suffered at the hands of that Jewish minority, and is far from the ideal of a one state that I think you had in mind. And then there are two other possibilities that depart from the first two visions. One is this ideal of a single state that recognizes the rights of every individual citizen within it. And the second is one that has deeper roots in the past, in which I think because of an absence of alternatives, we have to look back to, as we have to look back to other possible solutions. And that's the idea of a binational entity, recognizing that there are two nations, two self-identified nations, and what we need to do is find an equitable or living and livable political framework in which they can exist. And there are many variations of this. One of the most recent is the idea of two states, one homeland. But it seems to me, for better or for worse, this is where we're moving toward a moment at which we have to both return to history and think creatively about the future, because the current model seems to be dormant.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we can't take all the questions, but I think this was a wonderful talk, very thought-provoking. I think that a lot of the questions surround the solution or the hope. This is our, this is just like a human need. But I can say as an Israeli, and I guess as just as a Jew, sometimes it's just important to hear the other narrative, and that for itself has a huge value.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much for that.
I just want to say, if I may, I'm going to try and send this in chat. I don't know if anyone has seen the Israeli series Our Boys. If you have, I want to just promote a new viewer's guide produced by students of mine in a seminar last quarter, which was devoted entirely to the series. And I'm going to send it to Abir, and he can send it around if it's of interest to anyone. It's really been a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry it's been under these circumstances. I'm sorry that I crashed a couple of times. I'm always just delighted to be with my friend Hussein, and thank you, Abir and Rabbi Role, for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you.
I'd like to also express my deep gratitude for this experience. It's always great to talk with David, and I've been honored to speak with all of you. If any of you have any questions, feel free to email me. You can find my email online. It's no problem. It'd be very easy if you just Google my name. You would find it right away. It's firstname.lastname@gmail.com. Also, that appears at the end of all my Bloomberg columns. And there's an archive of all my articles and writings over many years at ibishblog.com. It's a single word, ibishblog.com. So if you want to carry on the conversation via email, feel free to do that. And I hope I get to talk with you again sometime.
Thank you so much.
Feel free to email me as well. Thank you.
And I do have a commentary on annexation in Bloomberg tomorrow, so you can look it up.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.